Hello, dreamers, and welcome back to the show. This is the third and final part of our Crazy Old Lady series, Golden Girls Gone Wild, the story of Olga Rutterschmidt and Helen Golay. If you haven't listened to parts 1 and 2, then you'll want to listen to those first and then come back to this episode. I'm just going to blow through the social media stuff and the support the show stuff. Leave a rating on Apple Podcasts, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Patreon, bonuses, episodes, join for $1, etc., etc. I've had a cold this week and it has been kicking my ass. So I'm going to try to get this done today because I actually have the day off. I've had a lot of days off from work, so I have really no excuses for doing this other than I just don't think I'm sounding like myself, but I really want to get through this series and get started on the next one and the Patreon, so let's get going. So in part 2, we left off with the investigation into the murders of Kenneth McDavid and the ongoing effort to link Helen and Olga to his death, as well as their victim from 6 years earlier, Mr. Paul Vados. The ladies have been taken into custody on fraud charges just to make sure that these two don't do any more murdery things while investigators work on building a solid case, because it's not going to be all that easy to convince a jury that these grannies are a pair of cold-blooded murderers. So we're going to go ahead and pick up the story from there. As I stated in the previous episodes, Kenneth McDavid's life came to an end in an alleyway, and I have not had the displeasure of ever being in a Hollywood alleyway, but I can imagine that it's pretty disgusting. I told you that the investigation revealed that the vehicle captured in the alleyway in the middle of the night before Kenneth's body was discovered turned out to be either a Ford Taurus or a Mercury Sable station wagon. Well, it was a Mercury, and on January 20th, 2004, a car dealership operated by a man named Mario Medina sold a silver 1999 Mercury Sable station wagon to one Olga Rutterschmidt. She paid $6,000 in cash for the car and told Mario that she was making the purchase for a friend of hers named Hillary Adler. At that point, Olga, who was accompanied by another crazy old lady, presumably Helen, produced a driver's license with the name Hillary Adler listed on it, but Olga provided a different address than the one on the driver's license. Mario Medina completed the sale of the vehicle and listed Hillary Adler as the new owner of the Mercury Sable. So, who the hell is Hillary Adler? Crazy old lady number 3? Well, it's a little more interesting than that. Hillary was a member of a local gym in Santa Monica called the Spectrum Club. While she worked out or did whatever it was that she did there, she would place her belongings into a secured locker in the locker room. While it was just 8 months prior to the purchase of the Mercury, back in April or May of 2003, that Hillary's purse, which contained her driver's license and social security card among other things, was stolen from the locker. Hillary never purchased a Mercury Sable in 1999, nor did she ever ask anyone to purchase one for her on her behalf. The sale agreement did not belong to her. It was not signed by her. She never lived at the address that the vehicle was registered at. The phone number listed never belonged to her. And in 2005, Hillary actually owned a Toyota Camry. So how was it that Hillary's name became entangled in Helen and Olga's crazy old lady web of insanity? Well, a look into the membership records at the Spectrum Club turned up quite the interesting bit of circumstantial evidence. Guess who was also a member of the Spectrum Club at the time Hillary's purse was stolen? No, it wasn't either one of these crazy old ladies. Helen and Olga's lazy asses can't even complete an honest day's work, much less a workout. No, from January 2003 Through February 26, 2004, Keisha Golay was a member of the gym and visited frequently. Yep, as it turned out, the crazy old lady apples don't fall far from the crazy old lady tree. Was Keisha Golay on her way to becoming one of them? Perhaps. Keisha was never charged with anything, after all. By the time Hillary was questioned by police, she wasn't even really sure when her purse was stolen, and it didn't seem like she ever filed a police report. Otherwise, there would have been a record of that. And even if it was known when the purse was stolen, and they were able to cross-check the dates that Hillary and Keisha checked into the gym, it would still all be very circumstantial. But it's not really that big of a stretch to connect the dots. The gym was in Santa Monica. Hillary and Keisha were members during the same time frame. Within that time frame, Hillary's purse was stolen, and then 8 months later, her driver's license ends up in Keisha's mom's best frenemy forever's money-grubbing hands, where it was used to purchase a vehicle that eventually ended up running over the man whom her murdering mom had been putting up in apartments and motels for nearly 2 years. We know that Keisha wrangled that 97-year-old man, Fred Downey, into signing all of his worldly belongings over to her just before he was run down and killed in November of 2000. Yeah, it stinks to high hell, but like I said, very circumstantial. So in all of my interneting around to see what I could find that you may not have heard yet about this case, I found this March of 2023 article entitled 6 Facts About Helen Golay's Daughter on this website, interestingly enough dedicated to Nigerian lifestyle and trending topics. It was kind of a random thing to be blogging about, especially in 2023, but I was like, okay, maybe they know something new and different about the elusive Keisha Golay. It was like the most disappointing article ever. I mean, I didn't learn anything I didn't already know. There was nothing more about Keisha in this article at all. It started off by saying that Keisha became popular for being the daughter of Helen Golay. And that's quite an interesting way of describing her as popular, but okay. So, Keisha's in the limelight because of what her mom did alongside another old lady, and that the internet has, for some reason, been wondering about her background, her career, her network, her relationship status. I didn't get the impression that there was all that much interest in Keisha, but again, okay. The article went on and stated, quote, "This post is an attempt to provide answers to some of the questions that may have been raised about Keisha in recent times, considering that she wasn't this famous before the incident her mother get herself involved with." Yeah, I'm reading it verbatim. The article then led with the question, who is Keisha Golay? And all it said was she was Helen's daughter. Then it asked, where is Keisha Golay from? The answer? The exact details of Keisha Golay is unknown, but she is most likely American. Well, duh. Helen's from Texas, and you don't get much more American than that. Then it said information about the school Keisha attended is unknown as well. Then the article posed the question, how old is Helen Golay? But I think it meant to ask how old is Keisha Golay? But I don't know. This article is really weird anyway. The answer, we do not currently have accurate information regarding Keisha Golay's date of birth or age, which is sad given the topic at hand. I'm not sure why that's sad, but I'm starting to feel like this article is kind of sad in and of itself. It goes on, in addition, we do not have any information about her height, weight, or any other physical measurements. All of these are kept private. To this day, the only information to the public about Helen's daughter is her name. Nothing else noteworthy about her life is known. Okay, so dreamers, we are 3 questions into this article entitled 6 Facts About Helen Golay's Daughter, And so far, we have about one fact, maybe 1.5. And by question number 3, we're being told that there's nothing else noteworthy about her life that is known. So, are we curious about the rest of what the article might have to say? Yeah, I am too. So then it says, on the internet, comprehensive information about Keisha's mother is nearly impossible to come by. She has received very little attention from publications or other sources. As a result, very little information about her, if any, is easily accessible at this time. So, I don't know what internet this guy was looking at, but I found enough information to put together a pretty good backstory on both Helen and Olga, considering the story had its beginnings dating back nearly 40 years into the mid-1980s. And even though the article told us nothing noteworthy is known about Keisha following the third of 6 questions, the article posed its 4th question. Is Helen Golay married? The answer? As previously explained, there is a limited availability of factual information about Keisha Golay on the internet. As a result, we were unable to confirm or deny rumors that she is currently married. So, I didn't know that the internet was abuzz with rumors and speculation about an obscure character in a decades-old crime, but again, maybe I'm looking at the wrong internet. The article goes and takes some liberties and states, taking everything into account, Keisha should have been married by now. Considering the years that this event has occurred, that's pretty presumptuous. Even though there is a strong possibility that Keisha is a married woman, this has yet to be confirmed. I must be living under a rock because I had no idea people were dying for the scoop on Keisha Golay. I'm pretty sure most, if not all of us, had pretty much forgotten Keisha's name, forgotten her whole role in the adventures of Helen and Olga, if any of us even remember she existed on the periphery of the story to begin with. Anyway, so then this question in the article wrapped up with this really weird sentence. Furthermore, Helen's daughter, Keisha's current romantic relationships are unknown. Helen's daughter is Keisha. So at this point, the redundancy in this article was kind of hurting my brain. But I continued on. The next question in the article, where is Keisha Golay now? And I'm pretty sure that all of you know the answer, but I'll tell you what the article said, just for the fun of it. Keisha Golay's whereabouts is unknown at this point. She doesn't have any social media profile, which seems to be untrue. I found a Keisha Golay on Instagram, but it's private. Based on what I've seen of her in pictures related to Helen and Olga's case, it appears to be her. I also found a Keisha Golay spelled exactly the same on Twitter, but whoever this Keisha Golay is, as far as I was willing to scroll through all of its super political stuff and her content and the people that she follows, it's all very right-leaning, so it was pretty boring. I can't really tell if it's her or not. But anyway, the article continued. People on the internet are wondering about her current activities and want to learn more about Helen and her daughter. However, internet users should avoid making hasty decisions until more reliable information is available on the web. So that sounds more like a public service announcement rather than us trying to dig up some dirt on Keisha Golay. Then the article goes completely off the rails and starts talking about Helen and Olga's trial and how the two of them had been recorded in that interrogation room where Olga is going on complaining about how many insurance policies Helen got, telling her, you can't buy that many insurances, you can't do that stupidity, honey, you're going to jail, they're going to lock you up. And that was basically the end of the article. So, to review, it said 6 facts about Helen Golay's daughter, but then the article only posed 4 questions. Who is Keisha? Where is she from? Is she married? And where is she now? And then only 2 facts were given, and one of those facts didn't really even answer any of the questions, and one of the answers was given in the title of the article. One answer was that Keisha is Helen's daughter, and 2, that her name is Keisha. we literally learned nothing from an article that excited me at first, only to disappoint me more than my life choices. So I'm going to say that the Nigerian lifestyle blog is about as legit as getting that Nigerian prince to deposit $1 bajillion into your bank account. Getting back to the Mercury Sable. After Helen and Olga were arrested and charged with fraud, investigators with both the FBI and the LAPD were working on their cases against the women. The FBI on the fraud angle and the LAPD on the murders. When Olga's place of residence was searched following their arrests, photocopies of Hillary Adler's driver's license were found inside of an envelope, and on the outside of the envelope, the notation read, Helen sent pictures of Hillary Adler with an Encino address, phone number, and birth date written on it. So at this point, what needed to happen in the investigation was for a definitive link to be made between the Mercury Sable and Helen and Olga, and hopefully be able to track that vehicle down because neither Helen nor Olga was no longer in possession of it. So there was this neighbor of Helen's named Mae Thompson. Mae was familiar with both Helen and Keisha and had met them on several occasions. In late 2004, about 6 or 7 months before Kenneth would be murdered, Mae filed a complaint with the city of Santa Monica about the way that some dumpster bins were situated in the alleyway adjacent to where they lived. They were too close to where the residents of her complex parked their vehicles. But Mae received no reply from the city, and the problem with the dumpsters persisted. Then in the spring of 2005, she noticed one day that there had been some red paint that had splashed onto the dumpsters and on the back wall of an adjacent apartment complex, and some of that paint had splashed onto a silver Mercury Sable. Mae took pictures of the red paint splashed on those places, including on the Mercury, and submitted those to the city as further proof that having the dumpsters sitting where they were at was causing damage to private property, the red paint being on the Sable being the most problematic. Shortly after Mae took those pictures, she witnessed Helen Golay closely inspecting the Mercury, but knew Helen typically drove either her Mercedes-Benz or her BMW SUV. On the morning of January 5, 2005, 6 months before Kenneth's murder, a parking ticket was issued to the Mercury, which was parked in an alleyway near Helen's place of residence. The ticket was given in response to a complaint that the vehicle had been illegally parked in that location. The investigation into the Mercury also found that it was issued a warning on July 12, 2005, about 20 days after Kenneth's murder, for having been parked at a location near Olga's place of residence for more than 72 hours. 5 days later, the Mercury was issued another citation for being parked on the same block as the apartment Kenneth had once occupied, which was within a few blocks of Olga's residence. 2 days after that, the Mercury received a parking ticket and a citation for expired tags. At the time, it was parked just up the street from Olga's apartment. After that, the Mercury Sable was impounded. If you know this area of California, then you are aware that parking is very impacted and scarce and valuable. So this is why these ladies can't just put this car in any old location they want, because it will piss someone off to see it there for more than a day if it isn't a regular vehicle of a nearby resident. The Mercury Sable ended up being sold at an impound sale at a Hollywood area tow yard on November 17, 2005. The person who bought it was a gentleman named Jose Quintero. Shortly after coming into possession of the Mercury, the new owner found it to have an oil leak, which he had repaired. The VIN number of this vehicle matched the VIN number Helen had written down on a post-it note that was found in a search of her belongings after her arrest. This vehicle was later purchased from Jose Quintero for what he paid for it by the Los Angeles Police Department. On the evening of Tuesday, June 21st, 2005, a man named Yoram Hasid was playing backgammon with a couple of friends of his, Masoud Khalifian and Behruz Havarim, at a furniture store owned by Masoud. The store was located near the intersection of Westwood and Santa Monica Boulevards in the city of Westwood. Yoram's vehicle was parked in the alleyway behind the furniture store. The backgammon game broke up around midnight, so he left the store and walked to his vehicle. After he got in, he began to drive south down the alleyway, and that's when he saw something suspicious laying in the middle of it. Yoram put his car in reverse, backed up to the furniture store, parked it, and went back inside. His friends were still there. When he went back into the store, he told Masoud to close and lock the door because he saw someone laying down in the alley. A little while later, around 1 a.m., Behruz drove Masoud down the alleyway to see if the person was still there. And that person was. They stayed in their car, but tried to take a closer look and thought the person might be injured or unconscious. Next to him was a bicycle. Masoud called 911. The dispatcher asked them to honk their horn to see if the person would wake up or respond. They tried honking, but the person laying on the ground didn't move. Behruz got out of his vehicle to take a closer look, and that is when he saw that there was blood on the man's body and on the ground. Paramedics and police soon arrived. I have previously mentioned that video footage taken in the alleyway would later reveal the Mercury Sable driving suspiciously through the alley. The Mercury made a left turn into this alley at 11:45 p.m., so just 15 minutes or so before Yoram left his friends to go to his vehicle. The Mercury Sable was then seen stopping, backing up for a distance, and then driving forward again and out of the alley. After the Mercury stopped in the alley, about 15 feet or 5 meters away from Kenneth, the driver cut the headlights. Kenneth's body was dragged underneath the vehicle for about 10 feet, a little more than 3 meters. But this Mercury did not make it out of the alleyway unscathed. Measurements taken of the car determined that there were only 6 inches or 15 centimeters of space between the asphalt and the underside of the car. Hitting something like a human body could do some damage to the car itself, which it did. Something under the vehicle involving the fuel line was damaged when the car ran over Kenneth, disabling it. The driver of the vehicle managed to roll the car into a nearby gas station where roadside assistance was contacted from the driver's cell phone. Records revealed that AAA, for those of you who live elsewhere outside of the United States, that's roadside assistance, a call was received from Helen Golay requesting a tow at 11:51 p.m. that night, June 21st, 2005, for a silver Mercury Sable. 40 minutes later, a tow truck arrived at a Chevron gas station located on the corner of Santa Monica and Westwood Boulevards, and it towed the car to a Santa Monica location. The driver who came to assist the broken-down Mercury was a man named Louis Jaimes. He said the driver of the vehicle was an elderly female, and she sat in the truck with him while he towed the vehicle to the Santa Monica location, near the intersection where Helen resided. At 1 a.m., a call to Olga's cell phone was made from the same phone that was used to call AAA, and according to cell phone tower data, the caller was in the city of Santa Monica at the time that call was placed. A return call was made from Olga's phone a few minutes later. So based on this evidence, it was determined that the driver of the Mercury Sable that hit and murdered Kenneth was in fact Helen Golay. The Mercury Sable, which had been tracked down and confiscated from its new owner just a couple of weeks after the ladies were arrested, was brought into the forensics lab for examination and evidence collection, which was conducted on June 6, 2006. The analysts observed red paint on the front left tire of the car. It was also discovered that the car's fuel line had been pretty cheaply, crappily, and apparently illegally repaired using a hose clamp. When this fuel line is damaged the way it had been, it would cause the vehicle's engine to stop running because the fuel source would be effectively cut off. Investigators experimented with a similar station wagon, and it was found that the vehicle would be able to coast down that alleyway where Kenneth was found to that Chevron gas station without the use of its engine. And also on the underside of the vehicle, the key that linked this Mercury Sable to Kenneth was found, and that would be DNA, specifically blood, biological tissue, and hair, all of it tested as a match to Kenneth McDavid. An examination of the scene of the hit and run where Kenneth was murdered showed that this was not your typical hit and run accident. Missing from the area surrounding the victim's body was any glass or debris that would have broken off the vehicle had it struck Kenneth at a normal speed of travel in an alley. There was also no damage, scrapes, or dents to the bike helmet that Kenneth would have been supposedly wearing while riding his bike. There was no damage to it indicative of it having been involved in a traffic accident. Also, subsequent to the accident, it was Olga Rutterschmidt who contacted the LAPD to request a copy of the traffic collision report, representing herself as a relative of the victim. Kenneth's autopsy revealed that his cause of death was multiple blunt force trauma injuries to his upper body. His chest and shoulders had been crushed. He had also suffered abrasions across 2 parallel tire tracks across his body. The toxicology analysis showed the presence of alcohol at 0.08, so legally Kenneth was intoxicated. He also had very high levels of Ambien, Vicodin, and Topamax, a combination of drugs that would very easily render a person confused and sleepy. Yeah, so these crazy, lazy, greedy old ladies plied this poor man with drugs and booze and put him in that alley and slowly rolled a 3,500-pound or 1,600 kilogram vehicle. Yeah, I looked it up. They rolled that over him and killed him. So later on, there was going to be much to be said in regards to who was responsible for what Helen's role was in all of this scheming and killing, and what Olga's role was, and also what, if any, Keisha Golay's role may have been. And it would throw a little bit of a monkey wrench into the trial to come, but it really wasn't going to make all that much of a difference in the outcome in the end. The question would be raised as to whether or not these 2 crazy old ladies were physically capable of doing what they were accused of doing to both Paul and Kenneth. Because while they were building the murder case against them for Kenneth, the connection, by chance of an overheard conversation at the police station, to Paul's case was made. His body was subsequently exhumed, but his toxicology report revealed that no substances were in his system at the time of his death. So it posed the question, could these crazy old ladies physically carry out these murders? Because of their age, it brings this into question, right? And there's video footage of them getting taken into custody, and both of them were complaining and bitching and moaning about what is happening. I have arthritis, blah, blah, blah. But the fact is, they did what they did. And when you've got a couple of $1 million on the line, people will do some amazingly batshit crazy stuff. There is also the mystery as to Keisha's complicity. With her, you've got to consider, is she a crazy old lady in the making? 25 or 30 years younger than both Helen and Olga? Could she have been involved and helped with the placement of the victims in the alleys? Yeah, she could have. But as I stated, no charges were ever brought against her. And according to this Nigerian non-article, Keisha Golay barely even exists. Clearly, women like Helen and Olga, they know no bounds. And when it comes to Helen, she would end up being more than happy to throw her youngest child under the mercury sable in order to save herself, without a moment of hesitation. Helen strikes me as a type of woman who would find an abundance of joy going around punching babies and kicking puppies just for the fun of it. Like Paul, Helen and Olga had taken out a whole bunch of insurance policies on Kenneth's life. But on Kenneth, they took out at least twice as many policies. While the number varies from article to article, the court documents related to this case indicated that from November of 2002 through March of 2003, Helen and Olga, both together and separately, submitted 17 applications for policies on Kenneth, but ultimately 13 of them were issued for a total of $3.7 million in coverage. Helen received $1,240,776.05 in benefit payments, and Olga received $674,571.89, a grand total of $593,195.16 less than Helen, but still not a bad take, considering Olga acted like she did nothing wrong in that interrogation room video where she sat there and blamed Helen for raising up the red flags by getting so many insurance policies. As weird and ridiculous as it sounds, by describing things being fair is fair when you're talking about double murder and insurance fraud, Helen did front most of the money for everything it cost to put Paul and Kenneth up for the 2 years while they waited for those policies to mature. She probably felt justified in undercutting Olga and going behind her back and taking out a bunch of policies in her name only, a total of 8 of them, but Olga by no means had clean hands, as she was the sole beneficiary on 2 of the policies. Helen just had more front money than Olga did. Otherwise, I'm sure Olga would have taken out more. So she had a lot of nerve to get all blamey and finger pointy at Helen in that interrogation room. In the end, the both of them were really cut from the same cloth. That's why they were able to work together on these scams and murders, while at the same time they were able to do so while hating each other's guts. It's just freaking bonkers how nuts these 2 ladies actually were. I know I'm not the only one who was thinking, what the hell is up with these insurance companies, right? I mean, what is happening here? How are these old lady con artists able to get over on all of these corporations? I'm sure part of it has to do with the fact that they're little old ladies. Who'd have thunk it, right? Honestly, there's no excuses because some of the biggest policies were taken out over the phone and by mail. Helen and Olga were no more than faceless voices on the other end of these phone lines. These insurance companies were issuing policies like an Oprah giveaway. You get a policy, everybody gets a policy. And Helen and Olga were all too thrilled to go around collecting policies like a couple of kids trick-or-treating on Halloween. Except Helen and Olga are like those shitty little brats who try to go around their neighborhood knocking on doors twice, trying to double up on their take. But unlike the stingy neighbors who call you out on your double dipping and shoo you off their front porch, the insurance companies weren't doing that. They were all too happy to sell them the policies because it all comes down to competition and the almighty dollar. Helen and Olga were issued 2 policies through Mutual of New York. Olga called their financial advisor, Eric Ritaza, and told him that she and her partner Helen wanted to buy life insurance policies on their business partner, Kenneth, to protect their business investment. He sent Olga the application by mail because she said that she did not want to meet in person. The insurance application Eric received listed Helen as Olga's business partner and Kenneth as the insured. Because Olga did not want to meet with him personally, Eric processed the application by mail. He never met or spoke to Kenneth, and he issued a $500,000 10-year term life insurance policy as requested. Olga was the one who provided the personal information concerning Kenneth on this policy. She listed her apartment as his place of residence, and when she mailed in the application, it contained all of his personal details and that his annual income was $65,000. It was also noted that there were no other existing policies on Kenneth's life. Because of the competitive nature of the insurance business, there was little to no communication or cross-referencing amongst companies at the time. The application also appeared to have been signed by Kenneth, but Eric ended up needing to have Olga fill out a new application because the one he originally sent her was the wrong one. When she sent in the new application, it had the same information and the same terms, but Olga did add that the beneficiary and the terms were to be irrevocable and that she and Helen were to share equally in the proceeds. Both Helen and Olga signed their names as the owners of this policy. In July of 2003, Olga called Eric Rataza again in order to purchase another $500,000 life insurance policy on Kenneth's life. He completed the application using the same information she had provided in the first one, and this policy was issued with the same terms as the first. During the application process on the second policy, Helen called Eric to make sure that the policy owners and the beneficiaries could not be changed. Helen represented herself as Kenneth's fiancée, and she was the one who paid the premiums on the policy. And this would end up being the insurance company that launched the investigation into Helen and Olga. Because even though Eric Rataza was more than tickled pink to issue those back-to-back $500,000 policies on the life of a homeless man he never met to a couple of ladies over the phone that he also never met, as he was all too happy-go-skippy off to the bank with his own commission checks, it didn't mean that someone somewhere up the chain wouldn't smell the two little old lady rat finks behind it all. And this would be the moment that we opened the second part of this series with. The representative from Mutual of New York who met up with Helen at that deli where she was a regular at, pulling a fast one on her by telling her that they had a check for her, only to slide her an envelope across the table that contained a check refunding the premiums that she had paid, along with a letter basically telling her to shove it. They're not paying her a dime. And then she followed that up with one of her world-famous indignant geriatric tantrums before she, in dramatic fashion, tossed that check back at the insurance representative and then click-clacked her Dr. Scholl's orthopedics out the door to go and call Olga so that they could start bitching at each other about how the insurance company was an Indian giver and that this is all each other's fault, before settling on this being all Kenneth's fault. The Mutual of New York denial occurred on December 8, 2005. Those letters to Helen and Olga explained that they were rescinding the policies, even though California law dictated that after 2 years, those policies could not be rescinded. But if there was some criminal activity attached to the death of the insured, like, say, a staged hit and run resulting in murder, or there was otherwise some fraud involved in the purchasing of the policy, then yes, the insurance companies can initiate their take-backsies proviso. At the time, the murders were far from being proven, but Helen and Olga were still under investigation by the FBI and the LAPD, and they were trying to make those cases against them. However, the insurance company was able to rescind the policies because they represented on the application that they, Helen and Olga, along with Kenneth, were investment partners in a non-existent company called HKO Associates, get it, Helen, Kenneth, Olga, and it was also determined that Kenneth did not have an income of $65,000. So would Mutual of New York have paid out the $500,000 policy if there had only been one of them instead of two? It's possible. I would think two identical policies on one person for $500,000 would be a red flag. That was on both Helen and Olga. In fact, Olga was the one who did all the legwork on that one, but it still had both of them listed as beneficiaries. So yeah, for Olga to sit in that interrogation room telling Helen that this was all her fault is a bunch of BS. Those were their two biggest policies, and both of their greed got the better of them. Not just Helen, as Olga was clearly trying to get it on the record in that room that they both should have known was wired for sound. But anyway, Olga was not about to go down without a fight when it came to Mutual of New York denying them their two policies totaling $1 million on a homeless guy. As ridiculous and suspicious as that is, I'm telling you, the audacity of this lady, right? On May 2nd, 2006, this was a little more than 2 weeks before the both of them were tossed into the women's lockup. Audacious Olga contacted an attorney named Joel Cohen as a potential client. She was looking for advice regarding filing a lawsuit against Mutual of New York in an effort to recover the benefits under the two policies that she was denied her claim on, asserting that Kenneth McDavid was a screenwriter and a business partner, further telling this attorney that the other beneficiary, Helen, was her business partner and Kenneth's fiancée. It was either in that initial call or in a subsequent in-person meeting that Olga had with this attorney that she told him that she was Kenneth's distant cousin. The in-person meeting between Olga, Joel Cohen, and his partner, Bill Chernoff, occurred in their Beverly Hills office on May 8, 2006. Among the things Olga brought with her to the meeting was a Mutual of New York denial letter and a partnership agreement for a real estate acquisition business. In reference to the partnership agreement, Olga said it was an incorrect version of the agreement, as Kenneth was a screenwriter whom she and Helen supported with a goal of sharing in proceeds of any successful screenplays that he might write. Joel Cohen reviewed the denial letter and explained to Olga that Mutual of New York's investigation found that the business partnership did not exist and Kenneth's income had been misstated based on tax return showing his income in recent years was approximately $40 to $200. Olga acted surprised about the denial because she believed the 2-year incontestability period had passed. Joel told her that the requirement of an insurable interest was independent of the incontestability provision. Mutual of New York was able to prove that there was no insurable interest related to Kenneth. But Olga, as Olga always does, pressed on. What if she was Kenneth's cousin or fiancé? And Joel was like, they need facts, not what ifs. Olga continued to insist that she wanted their firm to file a lawsuit and she would give them, quote, full authority to say whatever was necessary to make it a successful lawsuit. So as you can see, the greed is just oozing from this woman. 2 days later, on May 10th, 2006, just a week away from the LAPD and the FBI getting these two menaces off the streets, Olga met with Joel and his partner Bill once again and brought with her additional documents, including one that purported to be a partnership agreement, which designated the purpose of the business venture as profit sharing, quote, from the movie and television scripts/manuscripts of Mr. Kenneth McDavid. Olga asked why she could not represent that she was Kenneth's fiancée, adding that she and Helen had received benefits under a different policy where Helen had said the same thing. Yeah, because that's going to convince these two Beverly Hills attorneys to take on this shady old lady's shady case. She insisted that they take her case and file a lawsuit in order to get her grubby hands on that money, telling them she wanted them to do whatever it took to win. These attorneys showed Olga the door, refusing to go anywhere near this case. Okay, so now Olga goes next level when it comes to her pettiness and greed, if you can imagine this. So an investigator at Mutual of Omaha provided information to investigators regarding a term life insurance policy for Kenneth that named Olga as the sole beneficiary. Her place of residence was given as Kenneth's, and the application, dated February 20th, 2003, appeared to have been signed by him and stated that he was Olga's associate and nephew. So she's changing it up a little, which only made everything that much more suspicious when these policies would eventually be lined up and compared. Olga made the initial premium payment with a check that was drawn on her account, but no additional payments were ever made and the policy lapsed. A little more than a month after the policy was purchased, the insurance company received a phone call from a person who identified herself as Olga Smith, requesting for the policy to be canceled and for the premium to be refunded. Olga was told that Kenneth would have to be the one to make the cancellation, which never happened. So here we have Olga trying to get her money back, blood money, mind you, that she obtained when she murdered Paul. So Olga was at it again regarding a $20,000 policy that she had purchased through Globe Life and Accident Insurance Company on Kenneth's life in March of 2003. In the application, she again listed her address as Kenneth's, and she was named the sole beneficiary, claiming to be Kenneth's associate and cousin, and it appeared to have been signed by Kenneth. The initial and subsequent premiums were all paid through Olga's bank account. In August of 2006, 2 months after Kenneth was murdered, Olga sent letters to the company seeking to be reimbursed for overpayment of premiums. So what I'm gathering here from this is that since Kenneth was already dead as of June 22nd, 2005, Olga wanted to be refunded any money she paid to have his life insured for any amount of time after that date. The next month, on September 7th, 2005, Olga submitted her claim for the death benefits. When the company reviewed Olga's claim, the insurance company representatives noticed some irregularities, including the use of whiteout to alter Kenneth's death certificate, which was a certified copy, which I would imagine would make the document completely void if anything were done to alter it. But Olga, representing herself as Kenneth's cousin, claimed that she made that alteration on the death certificate in order to cover up Helen's address because Olga did not want the benefit checks to be sent to that address. The company eventually paid Olga the $20,000 plus the refund for the overpayment of premiums. So, in Olga's abundance of greed, to make sure the money went straight to her, she nearly cost herself that claim by messing around with the death certificate. Well, Helen was busy doing her own backstabby, double-crossy hoodwinking of her own behind Olga's back, too. She purchased a $20,000 life insurance policy through the same company, Globe Life and Accident Insurance, on Kenneth's life, listing herself as his fiancée and the sole beneficiary. Helen listed her address as Kenneth's place of residence, and the premiums were paid through Helen's bank account. After Kenneth was murdered, Helen submitted her claim for the death benefits, but the company denied her claim, despite Helen's repeated letters and threats to sue them. So in this instance, with this company, Olga out-backstabbed and out-double-crossed Helen by getting her claim paid out, while the same exact company denied Helen's. In September of 2003, United Investors Life issued a $100,000 term life insurance policy on Kenneth's life, with Helen listed as the sole beneficiary. Again, her address was listed as his place of residence. She listed herself as his fiancée and stated his occupation as being that of an investor. As part of the application process, it was necessary for the insured to be interviewed by phone and asked for the applicant to provide a number. The number given was Helen's cell phone. A company representative called the phone number but was unsuccessful in getting an interview with Kenneth on September 18th. 11 days later, on the 29th, an interview was conducted by phone and it was audio recorded. If you listen to The Thing About Helen and Olga, then you've heard part of this recording. At first, Helen was the one who spoke, identifying herself as Kenneth's secretary, and that she was going to get him on the phone in order for the interview to take place. There was a pause while Helen is purportedly getting Kenneth on the phone, but when you listen to it, it is clearly a woman attempting to deepen her voice while answering the representative's questions. Later on at trial, Patrick, the man who lived in Kenneth's apartment along with his girlfriend, remember the Michigan couple? He would testify that that voice on the recording was not Kenneth's, as Kenneth's own sister would as well, pointing out that he had once been in the radio DJing business and he had a very rich, deep radio voice. On September 21st, 2005, 3 months after Kenneth was murdered, Helen made a claim for the death benefits representing herself as the insured's fiancé. The company refused to pay, finding discrepancies in the claim documents that needed to be resolved first. Demand letters were sent to the insurance company, but were ineffective in getting the $100,000 benefit paid out to Helen. On February 13, 2003, Helen called the AXA Investment Network and spoke to a representative named Andrew Ziskin regarding the purchase of a 10-year term life insurance policy. She stated up front that she did not want to meet in person. After receiving some price quotes, Helen submitted an application dated February 19, 2003 for a $500,000 Empire General policy on Kenneth's life, listing him as a real estate investor residing at her home address. Both Helen and Olga were designated as the irrevocable beneficiaries and that they were investment partners. The representative, Andrew Ziskin, noticed that Kenneth's signature appeared to be made by rubber stamp, so he called Helen and requested that Kenneth provide an original signature next to the stamped one, which was apparently done. In some follow-up questions Andrew had, Helen answered that she was Kenneth's fiancée, Olga was his cousin, and they were all business partners. Helen stated that Kenneth's annual income was $72,000 and his financial net worth was $700,000. Helen was the one who paid the premiums on this policy. A claim for the death benefits was submitted on August 13, 2005, and 17 days later, on August 30th, both Helen and Olga were paid $251,575. On February 27, 2004, AARP Group Life issued a $25,000 term policy on Kenneth's life, with Helen listed as his fiancée and sole beneficiary. This policy was later amended to increase the coverage to $75,000. Helen paid the premiums, and after Kenneth was murdered, she submitted her claim for death benefits and was ultimately paid $75,796.51. An $800,000 10-year life insurance policy on Kenneth's life was applied for through AAA Insurance Company and was processed by an agent named Jody Resnick. The application listed Kenneth as a real estate investor and Helen as his fiancée and sole beneficiary. The contingent beneficiaries were Helen's daughters, and the premiums were paid through Helen's credit card. During the application process, Helen stated that Kenneth lived at her place of residence, and that policy was issued on January 17, 2003. Helen had the two contingent beneficiaries removed from the policy 9 months later. After Kenneth was murdered, Helen filed her claim and was paid $810,500 $556.39 in death benefits. So, dreamers, even though there were some policies that were getting denied, which really got Helen and Olga all worked up, it wasn't like they weren't getting paid out on other policies, these greedy old ladies. But anyway, a supervisor at AAA Insurance saw some red flags related to Helen's $800,000 policy and decided to take a more in-depth look at her other policies with their company. She found that Helen also had the roadside assistance through AAA and discovered that Helen had requested the tow service on the same day as the insured's death. And I'm not quite clear if this representative looked any deeper into it, but if she had, she would have seen that Helen's car was towed from a location less than a block away from where Kenneth was discovered dead. In fact, because Kenneth was found by those guys playing backgammon just a few minutes after he was run over, it's highly probable that Helen was still sitting right there on the corner with her disabled murder Mercury when police and paramedics arrived in the alleyway to attend to Kenneth. Helen was sitting right there with all of those emergency vehicles' lights flashing. Helen was probably too busy with dollar signs floating around her big old stupid hairdo to even notice, worry, or care. When the supervisor noticed that Kenneth died on the exact same day that Helen called for roadside assistance and that Kenneth was run over by a car, she turned that information over to an investigator with the Department of Insurance, and that person was named Kenneth Smith. Kenneth Smith then called Helen to inquire about her relationship to Kenneth. She said that she and Kenneth had plans to get married that December. Through further digging, Kenneth found that Helen had applied for another $800,000 life insurance policy on Kenneth and one for another man named James Covington. The policy for James was applied for on April 30th, 2002, and his place of residence was listed as the same as Kenneth's and Helen's. And I will talk more about this James Covington in a moment. Garden State Life Insurance Company issued a $100,000 term life insurance policy on Kenneth's life on April 8, 2003. The address listed as his place of residence was Helen's, and he was represented as being a self-employed investor with an income of between $50,000 and $99,000. Helen listed herself as Kenneth's fiancée and sole beneficiary on the policy, and she paid the premiums. Helen submitted a claim for the death benefits on September 19, 2005, but it was not paid as the insurance company sent her a letter to inform her that the payment was delayed pending an investigation. Helen responded with a letter of her own demanding payment on the grounds that the 2-year contestability period had been met. She subsequently filed a lawsuit against Garden State Life Insurance, but Helen would not be around to see her case make it to court. Great West Life Annuity Insurance Company issued a $150,000 term life insurance policy on Kenneth, with Helen again listed as the sole beneficiary, and she paid the premiums. As a part of the application process, Helen submitted a signed affidavit representing that she was Kenneth's fiancée. The claim was not paid despite Helen's repeated demands and threats to sue because the insurance company found indications that the application was fraudulent, including the fact that Kenneth had several other policies on his life and that his signatures on everything had been rubber stamped. An $800,000 term life insurance policy was obtained by both Helen and Olga on Kenneth's life from First Penn Pacific Insurance. On the application, they listed themselves as cousins and business partners of Kenneth's. It listed his annual income as $105,000 and that he had a net worth of $1.2 million. Helen paid the premiums, and after Kenneth was murdered, both she and Olga submitted claims, and they were both paid $402,000 each. American Life Insurance Company of New York issued a $150,000 policy on Kenneth's life on March 8, 2005. So this is one of the later policies that they purchased, this only being about 3 months before he was murdered, and it listed Helen as his fiancée and sole beneficiary. The premiums were paid through her bank account, and she submitted a letter demanding payment of the death benefits on December 12, 2005, 6 months after Kenneth was murdered, and only 9 months after the policy was issued. So this policy was still within the contestability period, and the insurance company ended up denying payment due to irregularities on the application, including the fact that it was falsely stated on the application that no other insurance policies had been taken out on Kenneth's life. They also made the determination that Helen had no insurable interest in Kenneth. When Helen and Olga were arrested on May 18, 2005, Helen was 76 years old and Olga was 74. I found some screenshots taken of them from the video of them getting arrested, which I believe I already posted on social media. On that day, both of their places were searched. A further search of Helen's place of residence was conducted on June 9, 2006, some 3 weeks after the arrest, and that led to a seizure of various prescription drug bottles, including 1 bottle of Ambien, 2 bottles of Vicodin prescribed to Helen, and bottles of venlafaxine and temazepam, which were prescribed to Keisha Golay, and those are an antidepressant and a seizure medication, respectively. Also found in Helen's apartment was a post-it note on a movie ticket with their first victim, Paul Vados' date of birth, social security number, and the names of his parents, his California ID number, and other vital information. The movie ticket that the post-it note was attached to was a 1999 film, The Bone Collector. When Helen's Mercedes was searched, they found a day planner with a post-it note on one page, and it had on it a partial license plate along with a partial VIN number. On the other side of that page in Helen's day planner was listed Olga's name, her date of birth, her social security number, her home address, her phone number, and her California driver's license number. There was another notation of the apartment manager's name where Kenneth resided, along with the office phone number and the cell phone number of the manager. I mentioned before that following Helen and Olga's arrest, even though that they were technically taken into custody by the FBI and charged with fraud, they were placed into an LAPD interrogation room in downtown Los Angeles. They were under arrest for those mail fraud charges, but they weren't exactly told right away that they were under investigation for murder. So as Helen and Olga were sitting there was a camera trained on them, but the only one who can be seen was Olga. Helen was sitting across from her with her back turned to the camera. I believe I posted that still image on social media already with part 2, and in this picture you can see Olga's greedy old face as she started to lay into Helen, blaming her for the arrest. You cannot make that many insurances. It's on your name only. And Helen replied that she wanted another room, that she didn't want to talk, that if Olga was going to keep talking, then she was going to ask to be taken to a different room. But Olga kept going, "You have to because you did all the insurances extra. That's what raised suspicion. You can't do that. Stupidity." We already know that Olga is as equally greedy and stupid as Helen. Eventually, Helen started to engage in this conversation in this interrogation room. She pointed out to Olga that the insurance companies were only coming after them for the mail fraud and stated that they have nothing else. Then the two of them sat there and had the nerve to start discussing filing lawsuits against the companies that had denied their claims for benefits. They also talked about the circumstances of their arrest and the information that was listed in the search warrant affidavit. Olga then stated, "This is very serious. Everything dragged into Paul." So here they are acknowledging their first victim, or at least Olga is, since his name may have been listed on the affidavit. Olga started back and on blaming Helen for, quote, making all these goddamn extra insurances. You were greedy. That's the problem. That's why I get angry. We had no problem with the relationship. You pay men and you be nice and you don't make extra things. I was doing everything for you, she said. Then Olga pressed Helen to admit that it was her fault for obtaining 3 additional insurance policies on her own. Helen admitted to getting the policies and further admitted that she paid for them. Further along in the conversation, Olga expressed regret for not having fled the country and not having gone back to Europe in April, the month prior to their arrests. But, all of that just goes back to Olga's greed getting the best of her yet again. If she had just taken her money and ran, she would have probably been able to live out the rest of her golden years peacefully back home in Hungary. But she would no longer be able to be involved in these scams. She wanted more. So, against her better judgment, if she even had any better judgment, she stayed in the United States. Helen just tried to remind Olga that they didn't do anything that Kenneth didn't want, stating Kenneth wanted all of this, and Olga agreed by stating, yes, we supported him. Yeah, because Kenneth really wanted to get crushed to death by a mercury sable in some dirty old Hollywood alleyway in the middle of the night. A few moments ago, I mentioned that there was, in fact, a third man whom Helen and Olga had begun to ensnare in their crazy old lady web of lies and murder. His name was James Covington. He's been interviewed by several TV shows that covered this story. And if you listen to the thing about Helen and Olga, then you've heard from him. And when Helen and Olga went on trial, it would be a chance for someone who finally was able to refuse the generous offers that Helen and Olga were making to him. Someone who lived to tell about his encounter with the 2 wicked witches of West Hollywood. In 2002, James was homeless and living on the streets of Hollywood. This would be a little more than 3 years after Paul was murdered and prior to Helen and Olga meeting Kenneth in September of 2002. So like the 2 men before him, James periodically received meals and assistance from the Hollywood Presbyterian Church. He was hanging out outside of the building nearby when Olga came up to him and asked him whether he was homeless. He said yes, he was. She told him that she worked with homeless people and she could help him get benefits and find a temporary place to stay if he filled out some forms. James said that he was interested, and Olga went on to explain that if he completed some paperwork, gave some information about his background and any disabilities, she could arrange for him to receive some money and to stay in the building that he was standing near. Olga then brought James to an office inside that building with a futon in the back room and told him that he could stay there temporarily while the paperwork was being prepared, as long as he kept quiet and kept the room clean. Olga then gave him the access codes for entering the building and entering the office. At some point during this initial conversation, Olga told James that she worked with a partner who was her boss. James stayed in that office for approximately 1 week, filling out some pre-printed forms and answering Olga's questions concerning his homelessness. He also provided her with his social security number, date of birth, family history, and information regarding health conditions. At the time, James was 45 years old, but to him, Olga seemed really genuinely concerned about him, like, your Grammy would be, or your Nana, your Mama, your Nona, your Yaya, your Nan, whatever it is you call your grandma. Just somebody who was like going to bake you some of your favorite cookies and just love on you like crazy. James just thought what everyone else saw, a sweet little old lady. But when Olga asked for personal background information, such as his mother's maiden name, James hesitated. Then there were at least 2 other occasions when Olga unlocked his office door without knocking and came inside when he had been sleeping at 3 a.m. to check on him. During that same week, she bought him a hamburger and gave him $15. There was also an occasion when James saw Olga outside the office building speaking to another elderly, grandmotherly-looking lady. So James decided to pack it up and leave the office where he had been invited to stay because Olga had become so angry and frustrated with him that she began to verbally abuse him when he refused to complete the paperwork that she had given. James made it clear that he never gave Olga permission to apply for any insurance policies on his life and was completely unaware that she had done so. Well, as it turns out, it wasn't Olga who had applied for a policy on James's life. It was Helen. An $800,000 term life insurance policy on James Covington was applied for on April 30th, 2002. On the application, James's place of residence was listed as Helen's address and also listed the address of the office building where he had been staying as his work address. A medical examination for James was scheduled for May 4th, 2002, but it never took place. James has no doubt that he would have been Helen and Olga's next victim. And I don't know for sure, but I couldn't help but wonder if Helen and Olga specifically targeted someone a little bit younger, a little bit healthier, a little bit more sound in mind and body, in order to be able to pay less money in premiums and to be able to easily pass medical examinations and things like that, increasing the chances of obtaining coverage. That greed always got the two of them in the end. And because James was younger and perhaps a little more well put together than either Paul or Kenneth, he was able to see the red flags and he listened to his gut. And I don't know if Helen and Olga encountered the same problems maintaining control over Paul as they did with Kenneth, but if they had, they probably wanted someone who was going to be a little bit more compliant and follow along with their rules. And if that were the case, if Helen and Olga were looking for guys who just did as they were told and followed rules, these men may not have ended up living on the streets in the first place if they had been more compliant and just went along with the game of life. Helen and Olga went on trial together in March of 2008. After a month-long trial, Helen was convicted on April 10th, 2008 of murdering both men, as well as conspiracy to murder for financial gain. The jury was deadlocked on the charges against Olga involving Paul Vados. The judge had ordered the jury to reconvene, but when that happened, one of the jurors just had to go on vacation, so that juror was replaced by an alternate, and once they went back to deliberate on the deadlocked counts, they ended up finding her guilty too. To me, it kind of sounds like a little bit of funny business with this last-minute juror swap and then all of a sudden deadlock turned to guilty. Like, sure, that juror, had to go on quote-unquote vacation, wink, wink. It sounds like that it might have been that one stubborn juror that was just impossible to work with, and the rest of the jurors were like, maybe you should take a vacation. In all, Helen and Olga raked in about $2.8 million from the various life insurance policies that they had purchased on the lives of Paul and Kenneth. Dead men walking. And what's even more sad is that Helen and Olga really didn't need the money. Helen may have been a little bit more well off than Olga, but neither one of them were really hurting financially. And if either one of them felt like they were, that's because they'd both been blinded by greed. They could have had everything and it still wouldn't have been enough. Their defenses were simple. Olga blamed Helen for everything, and Helen, she did not blame Olga. She couldn't. Helen was paid out more money. She was the beneficiary of more policies. She went back and forth between driving a Benz and driving a BMW, while Olga putted around in a Honda. And it wasn't even a Honda Accord, it was a Civic. Now Helen couldn't point the finger at Olga. Instead, she threw her own daughter, Keisha, under the bus, accusing her of being the one who was driving the vehicle that killed Kenneth. She was the one who stole the purse at the gym and used that stolen identification to purchase the Mercury Sable. And it was Keisha who used Helen's AAA to have the Mercury towed when it became disabled when Kenneth was run over. But the jury didn't buy it. Keisha wasn't in court. She was never really called to testify. And as far as we could see, she barely even exists. Believe it or not, these two crazy old ladies are still crazy, but now they're super old. They're alive and kicking, probably kicking themselves for being evil, greedy, and just nuts. Today, Helen is 92 years old and is being housed at the California Institution for Women in Corona, California. And Olga is 90 years old, and she is being housed at the Central Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California. So I guess their retirement plan wasn't so bad after all, considering they're still around doing whatever it is that they do. Now, I was going to end this episode here because that's about all I had written, but I last minute found this article on Vice.com, and it was from 2008, just after Helen and Olga were convicted, and I thought it was pretty interesting. So this episode is going to be just a little bit longer than the first two. So in this article, they interviewed one of the LAPD detectives who was involved on the task force. And this detective, his name was Dennis Kilconey, and he was a part of the department's homicide unit, but he was also part of a team that was assigned to high-profile cases. Murders of police officers, he was on the O.J. Simpson case, the murder of N.S. Cosby, cases of that nature. I'm going to share some of his answers that we didn't already know about this case from his perspective. He said that one of the things that raised a red flag very early on was the fact that when Helen and Olga came into the police station regarding Kenneth McDavid, his case at that point was being investigated as a traffic accident. Helen and Olga had no interest in the traffic accident. They did not want to speak to the traffic cop. They wanted to get to the coroner's office to claim the body, telling the coroner that they were the only people in the world who cared about Kenneth. There was no concern about what happened, how he died, who did it, had anyone been arrested, and if there were any leads in the hit and run. All they wanted was the body and the paperwork from the coroner's office report that indicated his death was an accident. Helen and Olga came back in the next few days to the police station to get the traffic accident reports. That is what they needed in order to file their insurance claims. At the time, it was a thing that the detectives did not know. They mentioned that they, Helen being Kenneth's fiancée and Olga being his cousin, had, quote, a little life insurance on him, and that other than them, he had no other family. 1 week later, the investigator from Mutual of New York, he showed up at the same police station wanting copies of the reports too, and he tells the investigators that Kenneth had a $500,000 life insurance policy and that these two old ladies were the beneficiaries. So slightly more than a little insurance. It was clear to the officers responding to the scene of Kenneth's death that he was a man who was homeless. All his belongings were on that bike that was on the ground next to him. Yet, for some reason, he has a $500,000 life insurance policy on his life. After the insurance investigator showed up at their police station, that is what sparked the discussion about Kenneth's case. And that is when another officer knowledgeable about Paul's case had eavesdropped on their conversation, and then they started comparing notes. In order for Helen and Olga to have collected on that policy, Mutual of New York required an in-person interview with the both of them. But the insurance investigator wasn't able to get a hold of them and they wouldn't call him back. So he flew to Los Angeles and came down to the police station in person. So once he showed up, it sparked even more conversation, and before long it came to light that these two old broads have two $500,000 policies on Kenneth. And it's dawning on everybody that there was more to Kenneth's death than just a simple traffic accident. When it came to the ability of these ladies to purchase all of these insurance policies, Detective Kilconey explained that there was a loophole that they were able to exploit in the system, stating, "In the insurance world, I could tell you what you've done with your car insurance and tickets and cars that you've owned since you were 16 years old. But on life insurance, there is no central index and there's no sharing of information between companies. So there's no way I could call some government entity and find out that you have 3 different policies and that you're a beneficiary on 4 other ones. It's a gray area. They were very schooled in this business. They knew things that the average person would not know, such as the 2-year contestability window. The courts have decided that if insurance companies issue a policy on you and they ask you all of the standard things, do you have life-threatening diseases? Do you smoke? Are you a race car driver? No matter what you put down, the company has 2 years to figure out if that's truthful and or contest the policy. And if it's 2 years and a day, well, then the courts have decided that they've got to pay the policy. Helen and Olga knew that, and that was the reason why they housed these guys in an apartment, paid their bills, and gave them some spending money for 2 years. They had quite an investment in each one of these guys, and all the while, they were looking at them, smiling at them, knowing that they were fattening them up, just like livestock. Kilconey was then asked, "Do you think Helen and Olga were ever really friends? They set all of this up, and they worked on various scams together for 30 years. It's almost like a marriage, but in the videos of them in the interrogation room, they were pretty bitter towards one another." And Kilconey answered, "Yeah, they were. Helen was most definitely the brains of the operation. She's worth millions of dollars. I don't know what caused her to do stuff like this." "Do you think her millions came from her illegal activities?" And Kilconey answered, "Absolutely." To back up a little bit, there was a man that she worked for by the name of Artie Aaron, and he was a real estate investor, broker, just wheelin' and dealin'. Helen worked for him for 15 or 16 years, and when he died in the 1980s, she ended up mysteriously owning a number of his properties that he supposedly had quitclaimed over to her. There was some civil litigation with his family members. Helen's always been deceitful. She also reached a point where she owned a number of buildings within blocks of the beach in Santa Monica. That's a high-rent district. Kilconey was asked, "What's going to happen to that property now that she's in jail?" And he stated, "She sold a number of the properties. I suspect what her lawyer didn't get, she stuffed away in other places. I had a guy from the FBI join the investigation, and his expertise was paper trails, bank records, that type of stuff. We brought in a guy from the California State Department of Insurance because this was their cup of tea, life insurance and bank fraud and tracking the paper trail. Between Helen and Olga, we seized around $2 million from the bank accounts when we arrested them. We froze their assets, but we weren't able to seize any of the properties because that becomes very intricate. If you have $100 in the bank and you put another $100 that you obtained illegally, then you go and purchase something for $120, I can't prove that the $100 that you used was not the legal money. Once you commingle money, you can't separate it out and start seizing things. The courts won't let you. So a lot of people were upset about that. Helen was selling properties for millions of dollars, and she still convinced the court out here in California that she was penniless, and the taxpayers paid for her attorneys. When it came to whether or not Helen and Olga were really friends, Kilconey said, "What I learned sitting through this whole thing the last couple of years is that they really weren't friends. Helen used Olga because Olga did the dirty work. She would find these people, she would go by and pay their rent, bring a check from Helen. Helen always had the money, but Olga would be the one to check on the people and be a nuisance, just keeping tabs. And Olga wanted to live Helen's lifestyle, and she got caught up in that. She was always trying to get Helen to invest in properties so that she could elevate herself to Helen's status. Olga lived in a little apartment in Hollywood. She was so crazy that whole apartment, since 1975 or 77, somewhere in there, had not ever been painted. It still had pink countertops and that olive green 1970s carpet, and she would never let anybody in there, even though the rest of the building had been upgraded. Meanwhile, Helen had expensive, fine furniture and very nice things. Early on, that's what was unusual about these women. It's not like they were convicts or gang members where you put their names into the computer and you learn their life story. All we could tell is that they each had a driver's license. Even though I took a lot of shit over it, I had one of our surveillance units follow them for a while, just finding out who these people were. Where did they go? Did they work? Who are they visiting? Do they get together? And not once over a couple of months of off and on surveillance did these women ever hook up together. So it wasn't like every Saturday morning they met for breakfast. It was nothing ever. And then we learned that years and years earlier, they were both swindlers, and they would hang out around the very expensive high-end hotels in Hollywood and Beverly Hills. Olga, for example, would pack a bag and go into the hotel and go into the dressing room out at the pool and change into a bathing suit and just hang out at the pool all day like she was staying in the hotel. She and Helen came across one another doing that type of stuff, and they developed a strange relationship. They were both using one another. They were very cautious about their relationship, but they fed off of each other. And it kind of continued until they got into the killings in 1997, when they started with Paul Vados, grooming him for his death. Kilconey was asked, were they blinded by greed or psychotic or what? He answered, I think Helen is completely a psychotic person. She is probably one of the evilest minds I've ever come across in 31 years of doing this. I've never seen anyone who was that calculating and evil. And Olga, she's got an evil twist to her too, but she's not stupid, just easily manipulated. Olga had a cafe in downtown Los Angeles a long time ago. Do you think that there was ever a point in her life that she was an honest person? And Kilconey replied, probably. She had a husband back in those days, and then she chased the husband off. And even though he had been gone for 15 years or more, he was Hungarian, as was she. She was always working it, stealing people's mail and applying for credit cards. There was a lot of identity theft stuff going on with Olga. And she never got caught? Nope, never. And the husband, he's dead. He hadn't been around in a long time, but he was still voting, he still had a checking account, he was still doing things, and it was just like, this is nuts. And Helen, some of the great crime stories we've heard over the years, those guys have got nothing on this woman. She will calculate for years how she's going to kill you and what her bottom line is and figure a budget for it. She seemed more concerned with the financial part than the execution of the actual crime, though. The Mercury Sable wagon that she ran over Kenneth with had to be towed when she was done. Later, there was still evidence on the undercarriage of that vehicle connecting it to the crime. So it seems that she was hasty about the crime itself, but pragmatic about the money end of things. When things would happen that would deviate from her calculated plan, that's what caused her trouble. Because if she had just parked that car and walked away from it that day, we would have never caught up with her. There was no connection between her and that car, but she didn't. She panicked, and that's what brought her down. Same with Olga, that and the constant greed. They were up to like $8.5 million in insurance policies on people. If they hadn't gotten so completely out of hand, we would have never caught on to it. Because the insurance companies, look, the insurance industry didn't cause this to happen, but the greed of the insurance industry created the atmosphere for it to happen. Everything is commission-based. Everything is driven by sales. Then Kilconey was asked, do you think that they did other things that they didn't get caught for and maybe were not on this scale, more like petty crimes that they got away with? And he answered, they reached a point where we had to consider a number of things. Hit and run accident stuff is not tracked like murders. If I've got a serial killer who's killing people a certain way, and he kills a couple in Los Angeles and a couple in Dallas and a couple in wherever, there's a communication system set up locally at the state level, and there are national systems to track that type of activity. And sooner or later, we're going to start connecting the dots. If someone drives over a homeless guy in an alley in New York City today, and then a month from now the same thing happens in Los Angeles, that would never be connected. We were like, we've got to keep our eye on the ball here. We have 2 murders, we have got all this fraud stuff, and even if we couldn't make the murder case, which we couldn't until we did the search warrants on their homes, well, at least we'll have them off the streets for like 10 or 15 years, and that would be the end of it because of their age. And it also would have bought us some time to continue the murder investigations, but ultimately everything started falling into place. Our job wasn't to do their biography. It was to stop what they were doing. Then along the way, we found this other old guy, Fred Downey, and that's a pretty sad story. Kilconey was asked, do you think Helen's daughter Keisha, whom Helen tried to blame for the murders of Paul and Kenneth in the middle of the trial to no avail, is completely innocent, or is she kind of shady? She's the one who hooked up with Fred. How do you think Helen pitched the idea of getting Fred Downey to move to California? And Kilconey answered, Keisha is a swindler. I don't think she was in on the murders. As for Fred, that came from Keisha. What happens to Fred is an elderly guy who retires up in Cape Cod. There's another daughter of Helen's up there who's a chiropractor, and she had apparently legitimately befriended old Fred. And Fred doesn't have a soul in the world except a niece who, if she's still around, she's got to be 80-something. Fred apparently had some means and bought some medical equipment for the daughter's chiropractor office. Expensive stuff like x-ray machines. At the time, Keisha was working in Manhattan as a model and would go and hang out at the Cape now and again. So she ended up befriending Fred and stealing him away from the other daughter. Kilconey was asked, was the other daughter romantically involved with Downey? And he answered, no, I think Keisha probably lured him in that way, but the other gal, no. But he fell for it. He's got this young, hot woman, and the next thing you know, Keisha and her chiropractor sister aren't on speaking terms anymore, and Fred is en route to Santa Monica, California, because he's going to go out there where it's warm and it's nice to live with this young gal. When they arrive, Fred immediately purchases a couple of properties in Santa Monica, an apartment complex and another multiple unit place like little bungalows, and that's where Keisha lived. So Keisha had graduated into Helen's league, and she had swindled this guy to buy some properties and put them in her name, and this sent Helen into orbit. And Helen and Keisha ended up getting involved in lawsuits against one another, and magically, Helen ends up with her name on these title to these properties, and old Fred is living in an upstairs unit of her triplex where she lived. Now, Fred is in his upper 90s, a frail little old man, and he's out here and no one's looking after him, and it's pathetic. He's calling back to his niece, please, can I come home now? Send me money for a ticket. They won't give me any money for even a bus ticket. We talked to his neighbors, and they would find him down in the alley where he'd fallen, and they would help him up. He wasn't eating, and occasionally they would see a Meals on Wheels service bringing him a plate or something. And all the while, Helen is right downstairs. She's got her hairdo appointments and her high-end life. Basically, they've milked this guy for every dollar he's worth. He ended up signing over his home in Cape Cod to Helen for $1. They completely cleaned him out. Kilconey was asked, how did they con him so bad? I see where he would be lonely, but how did he agree to these crazy terms? And Kilconey stated, well, whatever they told him, he thought the world of these people. They even bought plots in the cemetery back in Massachusetts so that Helen and Keisha would be buried next to him. That's pretty sad. Ultimately, Fred gets hit by a car, disoriented, in the middle of the afternoon, 20 blocks from the house. They said that he was going to the library, but there's a library in the other direction, just 1 block from his house. He gets hit by a car, he lingers in the hospital for a couple of weeks, and then passes away. This one's legitimate. He stepped out in front of a car, and the driver stopped in the whole thing, and that was the end of him. Kilkenny was asked, "That's a crazy coincidence, so I guess I veered off. Maybe we should get back to the case itself. How did things fall into place? Whose name was on the Mercury Sable that killed Kenneth McDavid?" And Kilkenny stated, "It was a woman named Hillary Adler. She didn't even know Helen and Olga. Her purse was stolen at a workout facility in Santa Monica some years earlier. Keisha was a member at this health spa, and we actually found the records that put Keisha and Hillary Adler in the gym at the same time. They both had signed in on that day, and her purse came up missing in the locker room. And they, Helen and Olga, wound up with her driver's license. And they registered the Sable in her name. After the tow truck hauled it away from the scene of the crime, how long was it before you guys went and said, 'Let's take a look at this car'?" And Kilkenny answered, "Well, originally we didn't know anything. We had that surveillance tape I mentioned, so we knew that we were looking for a Mercury or a Ford Taurus. And when we did the search warrants and we were going through Helen's stuff, we came across some partial information about a 1999 Mercury, and we were able to develop enough information to find the car." The car had been sold by the tow yard to an unsuspecting young Hispanic family in downtown Los Angeles. The guy fixed it up, and it was a station wagon for him and his wife and kids. We went and seized the car from them. I felt so bad about it. I mean, we had every legal means to take the car. It was a murder weapon, but I had the police department purchase the car from him so he could go and buy another car. I still have the car sitting in the parking lot at work. I don't know what I'm going to do with it now. We'll probably auction it off or something. We didn't even know that the car had been towed until an insurance investigator told us. There were 20 or more different insurance companies we were dealing with by this time, and one of them was AAA Life Insurance, the Automobile Club of Southern California. The gal who worked there got caught up in the stories and said, "Yeah, Helen and Olga have life insurance policies on this guy." So she got curious and did some checking on her own, and then she called back and said, "Helen is also a AAA roadside service member, and lo and behold, one time she needed a service that was on the night of Kenneth McDavid's murder, and it was for a Mercury Sable." Sometimes when it rains, it pours, and things just fall into place. Over the long run, in the scheme of things, if they had not been so greedy, if they had just been a couple of policies on each guy, they probably never would have been caught. Greed is what finally got them, in the end, when they were arrested. I don't know if you ever saw the video surreptitiously filmed in the interrogation room when the two women were alone arguing, but Olga lashed out at Helen. "You got too greedy. Greed is what got us caught." They knew it. Then Kilkenny was asked, "Why do you think, at that age, this stuff was even important to them? Like you said, Helen had money." And Kilkenny answered, "Like we said, Helen is psychotic. It's the thrill for her. Olga, as she said in the interview room, was saving. We took like $900,000 from her bank account. Her plan was to save enough money to move to Canada to hook up with an old girlfriend and open a business. And then she was just waiting for the final payoffs. And what happened was once we came onto the scene and started contacting insurance companies, they held back their payments. So in Olga's case, that caused a delay in her plan because she wasn't getting the money. You would think at that point, maybe the jig is up. I've got to take what I've got and get the hell out of here. But the greed got the best of them." Then Kilkenny was asked, "What do you think their mindset is now, sitting in prison? Defeated?" Kilkenny answered, "Olga will adjust nicely to jail. She will have her little living space or whatever she winds up with, and she will have her daily routine. Helen will be scheming all of the time, trying to get something for nothing, and she will stay in touch with the outside world because she's still got some capital out there, and she will be wheeling and dealing from the jail, just like one of those mafia guys. But they're both doing 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 50 years, so they're done. The first guy, Vados, they buried him for a rock-bottom price in just a sheet in a wooden box. They cremated Kenneth, so there was no evidence trail. They gave the ashes to Helen. The family of Kenneth McDavid would like the ashes, so we've been asking where they are. I suspect they went into a dumpster. At the end of the trial, when it was all over, the attorney for Helen came up to me and asked, would you be opposed to Helen doing her time in a prison near Los Angeles so she could have visitation with her granddaughter? And I said, I don't think I'd oppose that at all, but I'd be more inclined to cooperate if I learned something about the ashes. And he said, I can't tell you because of the attorney-client relationship, but if you were to get a call someday from an anonymous source that told you where the ashes were, don't be surprised. And I said, if that anonymous call comes, then I will put in a favorable word with the Department of Corrections regarding her housing location, and we left it at that. I haven't heard anything yet. So, dreamers, I found Dennis Kilconey on Facebook, and I followed him, and then I sent a message asking if he ever learned the location of Kenneth McDavid's ashes. And as of the recording of this, I have not heard back from him. So if I ever do, I will let you know. This guy is probably getting up there in years as well, so I'm not sure he's checking his Facebook every day. However, Helen is in the women's facility in Corona, California, which is about, I want to say, maybe 50, 60 miles outside of Los Angeles. So possibly she got what she wanted. I don't know if that's the closest prison to Los Angeles, but it's definitely within driving distance. And that, my dreamers, is the tale of the Golden Girls Gone Wild, Olga Rutterschmidt and Helen Golay. I want to thank you all so much for listening. I have an idea for the next episode bouncing around in my head, so I'm going to start working on that, and the Patreon will also come out very soon. I'll try not to keep you waiting too long. I'm getting better. Work is a little bit crazy right now, but come, I want to say end of May, June, my work schedule is going to scale back a lot, and I'll have a lot of time to devote to the podcast this summer, which I'm really looking forward to. I'll keep you updated on all of that, and as always, until next time, sweet dreams.